Hi, my name is Mark Goldberg of the UN Affairs blog, UN Dispatch, and welcome to the debut segment of UN Plaza, which is a new weekly blogging head segment in which we're going to take a look at foreign policy, but through the prism of the United Nations and other international institutions. Now, I'm very pleased to debut this program with John Prendergast, formerly of the National Security Council in the second half of the Clinton administration, and also affiliated with the International Crisis Group, and currently co-director of the Enough Project. And I guess by way of introducing yourself, John, you can tell us a little bit about what the Enough Project is all about.
Well, having worked in government for those years during the Clinton administration, and then coming out working in the NGO world, what was missing in our efforts to try to help construct policies or change policies to become more responsive to some of these places where terrible atrocities were occurring, mass famines, big civil wars, even genocide in the case of Darfur and Rwanda a decade earlier. What was missing is the public, is the citizen involvement in our foreign policy and with regards to these issues. And so for the last 2 or 3 years, we've been sort of grumbling about this. We need more political will. You always hear that at every conference you're at every speech you're at. So how do you generate political will? Well, you got to go out and educate people all over the country who are predisposed to caring about these things, caring about the world, caring about fellow human beings, and empower them to become part of the system, to democratize our foreign policy with respect to these kinds of issues. So that's really what Enough Project is about, is we're working with different groups that try to generate activist interest in issues related to mass human rights abuses, but make them smarter, to draw upon a network of field-based analysts in Africa through a lens of people who have policy experience, channeling that information to local communities all over the United States to better prepare them and help them understand what's going on in these places if they actually care about it, and what then they can do to actually respond to these crises.
So this is actually why I thought debuting with you, John, might be a great idea, because today over 75% of all peacekeepers in the world are currently deployed in Africa, and in the very near future that number will certainly only swell as peacekeeping sort of grows and is particularly focused these days, and in the very near future in the Horn of Africa. Currently, by the end of the week, we are supposed to have the single largest deployment of peacekeepers in the world to Darfur, but of course that won't happen. But in the very near future, from Chad to Darfur to the Central African Republic, to Sudan, to Southern Sudan, to Ethiopia or Eritrea, perhaps even Somalia, and all the way to the Indian Ocean, we could very much have peacekeepers deployed, because this seems to be where a new locus of conflict has evolved. And I was hoping that you might be able to explain to us sort of why the Horn of Africa has become such a central point of conflict these days.
Well, the interesting thing, of course, is to contextualize that, because the continent of Africa, by and large, is moving forward. Most of the continent is democratizing. Most of the continent is growing economically at rates faster than Europe and the United States. So Africa, in general, is moving forward. There are a few cases, there are a few countries that are mired in this cycle of internal conflict, regional conflict, and mass atrocities. Somalia, different parts of Sudan. We got Darfur and Southern Sudan, and Congo, northern Uganda. These places have continuous rounds of bloodletting, then temporary moments of tranquility while the forces of destabilization rearm and rest and rearm, and then they're back at it again. So each one of them is a different case. They have peculiar historical issues to all of them, but in general terms, certainly all of them are marked by situations where the power at the center of the states in question is contested by a number of actors, and there is no system in each of those countries for fairly distributing power and wealth. And whether you call that democracy, whether you call that equal access, whether you call it popular participation, whatever it is, they don't have it. And so the elements of society have been radicalized over time, and with arms have learned that they can actually achieve their objectives, or at least create havens where they control territory and for their own purposes, either political or economic, if they're mining particular commodities. So you have these, in the absence of well-articulated and well-constructed peace processes backed by an international will and leverage. In the absence of that, we're just going to keep seeing these conflicts continue, unless, again, rolling back to the earlier point, public here in the United States can say, you know what, this is unacceptable. It matters to us that people are dying by the thousands every week in these places, and we can do something about it. That's not to say that we send in the 82nd Airborne. That's not to say that the United States is a global policeman, but the United States has a role to play as the world's most powerful nation, an important role to play in helping to construct solutions. And that's really what our message is, that we can actually make a difference here.
So you're alluding to sort of the center of this state sort of having difficulty holding on, or trying to hold on to the periphery of the state through sort of brute force, and I guess that's been what we've seen in Darfur over the last 4 or 5 years. Though sort of the United Nations has approved this strong peacekeeping force to be deployed there by the end of the year, and it's looking sort of increasingly likely like that's not going to happen. And I'm wondering, sort of, what sort of do you see as preventing the deployment of the peacekeeping force UNAMID for Darfur?
Yeah, there's two reasons, and one is the inability of or unwillingness, let's put it that way, certainly much more than inability, of the countries that have been most vocal about genocide in Sudan or about the crisis in Sudan, their inability or unwillingness, again, to provide the kind of equipment necessary to make that deployment work. So in this case specifically, it means that helicopters that are necessary to make to allow for movement of the troops that are deployed by the United Nations and the African Union, those helicopters have not been donated to the mission by the U.S., the Europeans, and other countries that have them, and consequently they can't deploy the forces until they actually have that air mobility. So that's one problem, is logistical. The other problem, though, is that the government of Sudan is saying that it accepts this deployment, but it's rejecting that deployment by its actions every day. And there are dozens of ways that through red tape and bureaucracy and simply non-implementation that the government of Sudan is blocking the deployment of this force. And so with both of these elements together,
why is the government of Sudan so so intent on obstructing the deployment of UNAMID?
Well, at the bottom line is that this government still wants to win the war in Darfur militarily. It still wants to destroy the rebellion and the multiple rebel movements that have now emerged in Darfur. And one way to do that is to keep most of the external witnesses out of there, to keep the forces and agents of stability, like the United Nations and African Union forces, away from the theater of battle, and continue to fight to prosecute this counterinsurgency campaign, which many have called genocidal. So, basically, they simply don't want a competent external international force in Darfur, because they still have more destruction to achieve before their mission is accomplished.
Now, the UN sort of tends to be wary often of sending peacekeepers to a situation where there's not yet a peace to keep. And, it just seems to me that Darfur right now is not sort of a typical peacekeeping environment. And I was sort of wondering what is the current state of the peace process in Darfur? I know that last month there was a meeting in Sirte, Libya, though most of the rebel groups seem to have boycotted that. And there have been previous attempts at peace in the past, like the 2005 Darfur peace agreement. And I'm wondering sort of what's the current state of play of a peace accord, and what would make for a good peace process in Darfur?
Well, I think the peace process has been marked by, in Darfur, has been marked by one failure after another, sadly, because certainly every time you have a false start or an inadequate conclusion, you're just condemning more people in Darfur to die. And so the main problem has been that the Darfurian rebels have so divided that it requires a different kind of diplomatic strategy to engage these actors and bring them together around a common negotiating position. And you're not going to get the Darfurian rebels themselves to come together before there is a credible package laid on the table by the mediators for a solution in Darfur. In other words, to state it more simply, the mediators, the peacemakers, have to come with a draft agreement and say, this is how we think, after we've studied this issue and talked to everyone, this is how we think the situation, the crisis in Darfur can be resolved, and then begin the negotiations from that point. What they have done instead is go to the parties and ask them, what do you think? Would you do it? Why don't you lay down a first position paper? And then, so everybody's got all these drafts and papers and competing press releases that are being laid out there that simply don't add up or won't congeal into some kind of an agreement. There's no chance for that. So the mediators have to take a much more assertive stance in the context of these talks and be more proactive in presenting possible compromises and solutions rather than thinking they're going to emerge passively from a deeply divided set of negotiating actors.
Now, when you talk about solutions, you and Roger Winter recently wrote a piece that was up on your website of the Enough Project called an All-Sudan solution. And you link a solution to Darfur to beefing up the Comprehensive Peace Accord, which ended the 2 decades-long civil war between the North and the South. And I was wondering, so what is the current state of play of the North-South conflict, and how could that be linked to a all-Sudan solution?
Well, the war in the southern Sudan, of course, took 2.25 million lives and displaced over 4 million people. It was one of the deadliest wars in the world since WW2. And in 2005, after a long peace process that was in part led by the United States, a peace deal was forged between the government and the southern-based rebels. And for the last 2 years, the people who negotiated that deal, including the United States, moved away and put their attention elsewhere, some Darfur and other places, Somalia. And they lost the focus on this peace agreement that they had helped forge and then didn't help implement. So, predictably, the government of Sudan has obstructed the implementation of this agreement, and we are now reaching sort of a crisis point where people are simply not sure if this peace agreement is going to succeed and be able to last. And so the linkage that we're calling for is to say, well, these different conflicts in Sudan that continue to emerge and the different peace processes that address the different conflicts in different regions of Sudan are all manifestations of the same central problem, which is a minority government at the center retaining power by any means necessary, even if it means committing genocide. And we need to look at the broader Sudan problem, not hive off Darfur from southern Sudan, from eastern Sudan, from the far north, where all these different conflicts are brewing, but rather come at it from an all-Sudan point of view and link the processes making peace in each of the regions with each other and look at the issues in a similar way rather than allowing the government of Sudan to divide and conquer the international community as it has up till now.
Now it seems the Comprehensive Peace Accord provided for a referendum for the South, I believe in 2011, whether or not they would secede and form their own country. And the Comprehensive Peace Accord also provided for national elections to take place. And should these national elections take place, presumably the power of the NCP would wane. And I'm wondering sort of what incentive does the NCP have to abide by the strictures of this agreement?
Yeah, its incentive is the opposite. Its incentive is to drag its feet. Its incentive is to somehow worm its way out of the implementation and hope that it's clever enough in the way it does it that most of the international community is either confused or blames the wrong party. So the key, of course, is heavy pressure and a united international community focused on implementing the deal as it was signed, as it was negotiated, as it was envisioned to be implemented. And we haven't seen that yet. So it's not hard to do, by the way. I mean, it requires the United States and the Europeans and China and Japan and Russia and other countries that have an interest in this issue to work cooperatively on having the
Now, it seems that one of sort of the government of Sudan's sort of defenders, at least in the international community, has thus far been the government of China. Though they've never vetoed a Security Council resolution, they've certainly tried to water down Security Council resolutions to the point where they don't have to veto because they're generally not strong enough. What sort of, I guess, first of all, do you agree with that assessment? Secondly, what can be done towards China if in fact they do play such an obstructionist role that at least we've been led to believe that they're playing?
Yeah, they certainly do. I mean, they're the commercial partner of the government of Sudan. The government of China is, and so they have a vested interest in supporting their commercial partner in Khartoum. So it's very simple. The United States does it with countries that are our major commercial partners. So China, because it has invested billions of dollars in the Sudanese oil sector, has a very strong relationship with the government of Sudan, and they're going to defend them. So we know that. That's not a surprise. So then what do you do about it? You look for the pressure points. You look for some vulnerabilities on the part of China to lessen their zealous support for their commercial partner in Khartoum. And of course, the biggest point of pressure that one can bring to bear on the government of China is its desire to have a controversy-free hosting of the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing.
Yeah.
They don't. The growing international clamor against China's role in Sudan from activists all over the world is unnerving the Chinese, and it affects their calculation. If they think they can get away with it and continue to...
How much? I mean, I guess that's a question. How much do you think has it affected their calculus so far?
When the pressure was at its height 2 or 3 months ago, 4 or 5 months ago, I guess now we're in December, you saw the Chinese become a fairly constructive actor in ensuring that the Sudanese government would support the resolution authorizing the United Nations hybrid United Nations African Union peacekeeping force in Darfur, and I think that was the high point. I think people sort of said, "Oh well, looks like China's turned the game, worm has turned, and it looks like they've been able to change the government of Sudan's policies." Well, and of course, the reality is the government of Sudan, as soon as people's spotlight turned off them, went back to their old shenanigans, and the Chinese, once it realized that, in fact, perhaps the pressure was going to diminish now, they simply went back to their old ways. So it is going to require, I think, a continuing campaign of pressure against the Chinese government, rooted in the shaming of China over its support for Sudan in the context of the Olympic Games and the backdrop of the Olympic Games.
I guess China's obviously not much of a democracy, so it seems hard for them to be shamed by their own people. Who should do this shaming? Should athletes?
Can you hear me okay?
Threaten to boycott the Olympics? What do you think is sort of the best way to go about applying this pressure?
Oh, we lost him a little bit. Not that we lost him. You still there?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I got your question.
I'm having trouble hearing you as well. I'm sorry.
If you can hear.
I think
no, I heard
phone
you. I heard
coming
you.
in and out.
I heard you. I just didn't. It was breaking up. The thing with China is that it has a desire to present a new face to the world, there's a lot of dynamic discussion going on in Beijing about the nature of China's foreign policy. It's not a static game, and there are a lot of reform-minded Chinese officials who want to see China come into the 21st century.
But before we got cut off, we were talking a bit about China and about how one might, or how sort of athletes or who might be the appropriate people to be applying pressure on Beijing vis-a-vis sort of their relationship with Sudan, which, as you explained earlier, is destabilizing the entire region.
Yeah, I think it's really. I think it's helpful having some of these athletes and actors and entertainers highlighting China's central role in the facilitation of the atrocities being perpetrated in Sudan. And I think that that this background noise, if it can become loud enough, would actually have a negative impact on China and make them recalculate basically whether they should continue with their unconditional support for Khartoum's policies in Darfur. And that's basically the objective: is you want to nudge them out of the camp of outright obstacle to change into the camp of either neutrality so that others can do things, or actually at times constructiveness, like they were when they got the Sudanese to accept in principle the deployment of the United Nations force. So I think the way to do that is just to raise the political temperature internationally on the Chinese and getting them to really realize that there's going to be a consequence, and the consequence is going to be that their cherished aim of an unblemished coming out party in Beijing in 2008 is simply not going to be possible as long as they provide uncritical support and facilitation to the Khartoum regime's atrocities in Darfur.
Now, sometime in 2008, hopefully, if this strategy succeeds, if Khartoum realizes that it has more to lose by opposing a UN peacekeeping force than keeping at its intransigence. One would hope that in the middle of 2008 there's a peacekeeping force in Darfur. And presumably at that same time there will not yet be a full peace settlement in the works. What can a peacekeeping force in Darfur do to help sort of support the peace process that you were speaking about earlier?
Well, you have to deploy. I think the objectives are fundamentally peace and protection together. And so the idea is that you pursue the peace process in Darfur and implementation of the peace deal in southern Sudan, this comprehensive peace agreement, you pursue those at the same time as you're pursuing protection of people in Darfur through the deployment of this United Nations African Union force. And the two elements going forward together, forward movement on the peace process helps reinforce security on the ground and protection of people. And if you further protect people and create a cost for those that would damage stability, then you're going to give a better chance for those that are around the peace table to succeed at their endeavor. So it's really the kind of hand-in-glove effort that is necessary, comprehensive effort that's necessary for peace, that you have to work both for a peace agreement at the same time as you're working to protect the people while they're waiting for peace.
Mm-hmm. I guess, the final topic I wanted to broach, it would be sort of American policy towards the region. Seems to, as you've described in a recent Foreign Affairs article with your colleague Colin Thomas Jensen, has preferenced, at least recently, short-term goals in the region over sort of long-term stability. And these short-term goals that you've identified as principally being counterterrorism efforts. And I'm wondering if you still see that as the case, and sort of what the U.S. could do to be a more productive partner for peace in the region.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, that just like in the Cold War with the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we had a singular emphasis on our foreign policy on containment of the Soviet Union. Similarly now, war on terrorism pervades everything the United States does, everywhere, including Africa. And so you have in Somalia, the United States supporting overthrowing of a government in Somalia and supporting airstrikes by the United States Air Force against targets in Somalia. You have in Sudan making these tragic choices to cooperate with the Sudanese security agencies to get information about counterterrorism objectives, but compromising or trading basically away what could have been a much more robust and firm opposition to the terrible atrocities being committed in Darfur. So we're basically trading access to information, unreliable as it is, for robust countering of what the United States itself called genocide.
Now, that's not limited, though, that stance to Darfur, but as you write, in Ethiopia and Somalia as well, the U.S. has sort of traded stability for this, or traded stability for preferencing Ethiopian attacks on Somalia and the Ethiopian invasion of Somalia this summer.
Yeah, but it's a foolhardy and short-term strategy, which is already proven to be inadequate. I mean, we've got further conflict in Darfur and potential resumption of conflict in the south, and to show for it, I'm not sure what we have. A few little tidbits of information. And in Somalia, we've strengthened the radicals' hand, and we've ensured that through our support for the Ethiopians and the Ethiopian invasion, that we've ensured that there'll be an insurgency and a war going in Somalia for a long time to come, unless there's a real change. So it's damaged policy, and hopefully the next administration will have the foresight to change it quickly.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're in a position to discuss this, but do any sort of the candidates stick out to you as having sort of a productive stance or productive statements on the sort of problems that you've identified in the Horn?
Yeah, I think the three frontrunners on the Democratic side have spoken out a lot and put a lot of thought into constructing policies that they would pursue if they became president. Obama, Clinton, and Edwards all have been there in the region, and they all have very strong I think, desire to really make a difference. I think perhaps the candidate Obama would perhaps distinguish himself the most because of the kind of approach he would take, at least as far as he's articulated up till now. But I do believe that all three of the candidates are very, very strong on this issue. The Republicans have not been as clear. It doesn't seem like any of the candidates really know much about the issue. Of course, the one that dropped out recently, Sam Brownback, was very involved and engaged in these issues. But the ones he's left behind haven't really made a very clear statements or indicated that they really had much of an understanding of what was going on in places, including Sudan, which the Republican Party has been very strong on in Congress. So it's a bit surprising we got these candidates. None of them really know anything about the continent.
Yeah, no, and Brownback and Obama were the co-sponsors of the Darfur Peace and Accountability Act, a few years back. And I guess to wrap up, it's interesting. I think what you said earlier, that sort of Sudan is sort of playing itself out as a repeat of the Cold War, where these short-term alliances are harming our longer-term interests. And it's actually something that Donald Payne said to me. He's the Democrat from New Jersey and the head of the Africa subcommittee. He said, precisely that. What I'm seeing is a repeat of what I saw in the Cold War, and it's only to tragic outcomes.
Yeah, that's absurd.
I guess we're pushing the limit of your time here. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, Mark,
for taking your time to speak with me, and we'll let you know when this goes.
Okay,
on.
buddy. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.